Hello and welcome to another edition of Professor Speaks. My name is Alex Hernandez. Alongside me as always is Dr. Craig Stern. And before we get into our topic, we want to make sure you subscribe, hit the little bell for notifications. And our topic for today is going to be about prevention. The staff around here really thought it was important that we talk about prevention because we've kind of remarked on it a little bit in the past with our diabetes episode, and I believe antibiotics was probably a part of that too. Prevention is a huge part of our healthcare organization or healthcare as a whole because it costs so much for a lot of these medications, a lot of these procedures. And one thing Em had brought up before we went on the air was that the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, they're both the same thing. Affordable Care Act and Obamacare is the same thing. And in the Affordable Care Act they covered a lot of these preventative tests like colonoscopies, and you want to name off a couple others?
Well, yeah, what they had was essential healthcare benefits that people didn't have to pay copays for.
Right.
So that they would have a yearly physical, that they would have their tests done, etc. With the idea being that if you have the test done, you find the problem early rather than when it happens.
Right.
So it's easier to prevent what goes on. And by the way, just to be fair, so that full disclosure, Pharma in its analytics deals a good deal with preventive issues where we're finding both medication problems as well as coordination of care problems, as well as issues with regard to compliance and a host of other issues. So we're dealing with that kind of thing all the time.
Right, and we see it all the time, and we see areas where these type of medications that are being prescribed could have been prevented just by simple procedures and tests that are not, or that were always covered in the Affordable Care Act. One thing we wanted to touch on was the organization is HealthyPeople.20. Am I right?
Yeah.
And well, what are some of the main things that they focus on with Healthy People 2020?
Well, the ultimate issue here is that there are perhaps issues that we can deal with prevention that are dealt with by pharmaceutical companies. There are issues to deal with prevention based on healthcare professionals dealing with identifying problems in order to try and solve them now versus them becoming serious problems.
Right.
But the federal government also got involved. And the federal government, for each decade, has set a group of goals, a group of objectives for the population to say, here are things that you should be doing that will help to have a healthier population. People will lead healthier lives. They'll be more productive lives. They'll be able to live and enjoy their lives without a lot of medical complications. The latest is Healthy People 2020. There was one a decade before, etc., and what goes on. So that's what Alex is talking about.
Yes, the website is HealthyPeople.gov. It seems like they came out a little early. Do they come out always 2 years in advance?
Well, actually, they try and come up a few years in advance because the goal is to have it by 2020.
Got it.
So they're doing it perhaps a decade in advance to say, here's the goal, here's the hill that we want to climb, and we want to deal with it with regard to weight loss and diet and exercise and stop smoking and control your blood pressure and control your diabetes, etc.
Another part of this is the use of technology now that's being used to help prevent all these health risks. Say when you're, for diabetes, for instance, like we just did an episode on diabetes, they're testing your blood sugar levels with Bluetooth technology now.
They are.
Like, how does that work?
Well, in the past, people complained or criticized healthcare that healthcare professionals weren't doing anything to try and move the system along, make it easier, more efficient, etc. Right. And they were criticized, and it was true, they criticized doctors and pharmacists and hospitals, etc., over the issue that healthcare wasn't doing anything to improve the situation, lower costs, things like that. And people were just doing it because they wanted to keep making money in whatever they were doing.
Right.
In reality, what was happening is the technology wasn't there. So that now the technology comes up and you can have technology on your wrist, you can have technology on your phone, etc. they have come up with technology where sensors are involved, and those sensors, Bluetooth sensors, can identify pulse rates. They can identify issues with regard to blood pressure in some respects, blood sugar now that you can do, and they put sensors on your skin so that they can measure that and deal with it. So technology is helping us to move it. Right. And interestingly, with all the people that were criticizing healthcare professionals, some of the earliest adopters and people who are getting involved with it faster are healthcare professionals. So either way, criticize, not criticize, whatever, technology is moving us down that road, because ultimately in research, there's always been, you put on a suit, but in research systems, the suit or the tie or shirt that you're wearing would have sensors in it so that they could have a continual monitoring. Right. Clearly, it wouldn't be any good for everyone because it wouldn't show anything. Right. But in certain populations, elderly populations, people that have kidney disease or liver disease or cardiac disease, etc., that there'd be something where you could be monitoring all the time, see the problem, fix the problem before it gets worse, so that while you can't solve kidney disease, you can certainly identify that it's getting worse and try and solve it right away.
Control it. And Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's pretty amazing stuff. But, I mean, when you look at these new technology that's being introduced into the healthcare world, do you also have these new drugs or new therapy that takes years for it to get approved by the FDA in order for the patient to use it or for a doctor to recommend it to a patient, right? So what kind of process does technology have to go through in order to just be approved? Because that's rapidly changing every year.
Yeah, it is. And many of these things have to go through the Food and Drug Administration, right. Not with the drug chain, but with the device chain, where they have to be developed and approved. You want the results of a really good technology. Right. But you don't want it where they're measuring your pulse rate, for example, and they're coming up with numbers that are totally inaccurate. So that anyone who's looking at it, including the individual, gets all worried because their numbers don't reflect what really is happening. Right. So their role in that regard is to have standards, improve those standards over time, and then to make sure that whatever the technology is dealing with those standards, so that you can depend upon the fact that whatever pulse rate, pressure, diabetes, whatever, that it is going to be an accurate number.
Right. And of course that's important. Well, you hear a lot to get a drug approved, or a lot of manufacturers also say this as justification for the price of a drug, right. Was the long R&D process, right. Where it was like a 7-year process or however long it is. With technology companies have to go through that many years process because we know that technology every year is changing. I mean, it's getting better and better, and there's a huge push to it.
Yeah.
And
well, the Food and Drug Administration and other government organizations have to figure out how to do things better and faster in order to deal with change, whether it's in new specialty drugs, whether it's in new devices or otherwise. They have standard, very laborious, very resource intensive, very expensive processes for doing that, for all of those things, for drugs, devices, etc. Right. And so you're right, they need to find better and faster ways to deal with it because they are. In the past, what they've had is what they call accelerated review, which right. means that there's a new drug for cancer, or there's a new antibiotic, or there's something that is pressing in the population and you need the result. Right. So they've done fast track or accelerated reviews, and those have speeded up the process. Perhaps not as fast as everybody would like, right. But by the same token, you want the results, but you want them to be right. So they're trying to get that done. And absolutely, government tends to trail what the industry is doing, and it's got to find ways to improve that.
But another thing that we need to talk about before we go is vaccinations. And that's it's been very controversial. I mean, a lot of there's a certain part of this population that can't or doesn't want to believe that vaccinations would really help to prevent further illnesses.
Look, at the risk of offending some people,
don't worry about it. They're not.
Let's address that. One of the easiest ways to deal with prevention is with vaccinations. It's not easy to develop it. It's not easy to market it. And certainly in some cases it's not overly expensive, but there's still a cost to it. At one point, some researchers came up with a study that identified that giving people vaccinations or children vaccinations led to autism. Those were phony studies. The investigators recanted on their results, lost their degrees, the papers were pulled. It was very clear to everyone who was looking at it, trying to substantiate, trying to reproduce results, that this was just phony, bad stuff. But for whatever reason, it created a firestorm among worried parents, among other people that looked at it and said, oh, this is really bad. We can't let people get vaccinated. Right. At the end of the day, this is just baloney. It's nonsense. The vaccinations that are there have a significant purpose. They have a significant value in trying to inoculate the population. Are they perfect? No, they're not. No. Clearly, as things have gone on, they've improved situations. We don't see polio like we did at one time. Right. We don't see some other infectious diseases that we do at one time. But things still exist, and they morph and they change, and you have to find ways in order to address it. But the notion that they're not safe is trying to say, well, there's whatever, a 0.5% chance that somebody can get something. That's significantly less than what it is if you're taking an oral drug or otherwise, and we have to manage that so that you get the benefits, and you have to manage the risks. That's just the basics of what goes on. From the standpoint of vaccinations, it's critically important, even with people who are afraid of the needle. It's terribly important that people get it because there is such a thing as herd immunity. If you and I get it, but M doesn't, then M has the opportunity in order to create a situation where other people are going to get it. So the entire herd is subject to what she does more than what we do. Right. We need to make sure that everybody has it so that you're not making it available and other people are getting sick. I'll give you a perfect example, but it's only an example. Okay. We've had a horrible flu season this year. Everybody knows about it. The flu vaccine was not as sensitive to the different A-level viruses that there were. Right. The vaccine did have B-level viruses. And so what happened with that is that many people didn't get it because they heard that people, even though they got the shot, they still got sick. Well, that can happen, as we talked about, I think, some time ago. It covers maybe 6 of the different variants. There's 144 of them, so it doesn't cover everything. But what did happen was over time, flu finally began to run its course, but the B-level virus began to show up. So there was a bit of a resurgence, and the concern was that the flu was going to have a resurgence, and now we're going to have another problem. Well, for those people that got the vaccine, that wasn't a problem. Right. For those people that didn't, it was. And so there was an added emphasis to go get a vaccine, to go get the vaccination so that you can protect against the sequelae of what's going on, not just the disease. That's just one example of many to identify what's going on.
All right, so really quick before I move on, sequelae, please define that. I'm going to write that down.
Sequelae are results.
Okay. All right.
Wanted or unwanted, they're the results.
See, Professor Speaks. That's why we named this topic Professor Speaks. So that's really all we had for today. If you had any other questions regarding prevention, please leave them below or direct message us. One thing I wanted to kind of just wrap everything together was the American Heart Association also gave us 7 key factors for prevention. Actually, it's called Life Simple 7. If you could help me in defining each one, that'd be great. So the first one is manage blood pressure.
Sure. The number one source of disease over the last several decades has been heart disease. And so you want to prevent issues to deal with heart attacks and stroke. Mm-hmm. Blood pressure is one way to do that.
Right. And of course, American Heart Association will focus on that, of course.
Sure.
So, and another one is control cholesterol.
Same kind of thing. Elevated cholesterol leads to blocked arteries. Blocked arteries lead to potential heart attacks. So you want to try and prevent that as much as possible.
Right. And then the next one is reduced blood sugar.
Sure. Well, when we're talking about disease, we're dealing with microvasculature or problems in all the little vessels. And that deals with blood pressure and diabetes, etc. Controlling diabetes controls complications of diabetes with kidney disease, eye disease, heart disease, brain disease, among other things.
Right. And another one is get active.
Yeah. It's an independent risk factor.
Itself.
Yeah, it does, but it's an independent risk factor. So even if you are lowering your cholesterol, lowering your blood pressure, lowering all of these things, it's an independent risk factor to get active, because if you're not active, then you have yet another risk factor for getting those diseases.
Right, right. And eat better.
Eat better, same thing. It's an independent risk factor. Mm-hmm. So even if you controlled all of those medical things with blood pressure and cholesterol and all of that, not eating well or even diet, these are independent risk factors, and you can still have disease because you didn't follow that.
Right. There seems to be like overlapping.
It's overlapping issues.
Because the next one is lose weight, and one could argue if you get active and eat better, chances are you're probably going to lose weight.
Absolutely. And increased weight leads to a host of problems with cardiovascular disease, potentially some cancer disease, etc. And so it's terribly important that people lose weight. It's hard. It's really hard.
Right.
But at the same time, it's important.
It's very hard.
The ex-football player says it's hard.
It's very hard. They should stop making that food taste so good. And probably the most controversial one is stop smoking.
Yeah, I don't know if it's controversial. It's terribly important. Smoking, once again, deals with the microvasculature, but it also constricts blood vessels. Constricting blood vessels leads to higher blood pressure, leads to potential issues with regard to stroke, certainly with cardiovascular disease and heart attacks, and then a host of other problems.
Okay. And that was it. That was all the 7 important key factors that pointed out from the American Health Association. And we will also list them down below, and we'll also provide a link for you to be able to view these 7 key factors.
Good. That's good.
And Dr. Stern, you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just mention that M noticed that you have a black eye because
yes, my daughter kneed me in the face yesterday. So
your 5-year-old daughter.
My 5-year-old daughter kneed me in the face. And
so we want to prevent that.
A tip to all you fathers out there: have your wife change your kids. Don't do it. And that's all for today. We would like you to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, like, comment, share with a friend. We'll have new videos for you every Friday, and a good way to reach us is you visit our website, propharmaconsultants.com, and we will see you next week.